In the summer of '73, US scientists did a remarkable experiment. The driver of this car had told no one where he was going. At the same time, 5 miles away, shielded from all known means of communication, physicist Russell Targ sat with a man who said he could describe the place the car would end up. By the currently understood laws of science, it should have been impossible. But it wasn't. These are the first words the man said.
I'm seeing boat dock, boat jetty. Yes, definitely. Lots of little boats. Motor launch, sailboats. Definitely, boat dock or jetty.
For the past 10 years, we've been investigating a phenomenon called remote viewing.
Flashing.
We found that many individuals are able to accurately describe what's going on in distant locations, blocked from any kind of ordinary perception. As a physicist, I would have to say one of the findings is that the mind is no longer limited by the parameters of the body. The person's consciousness and awareness is able to transcend space and time and describe what is going on hundreds or thousands of miles away or hours or days in the future.
You are going to go on holiday. Actually, you're not going to go as far as what you even anticipate. You're hardly even going to get there.
The public face of the paranormal.
You'll be a survivor. So
These days, it's a boom industry, and psychic bestsellers abound. The world of science poo-poos it all as dangerous stuff and nonsense. But behind the scenes, some scientists have dared to investigate it. In laboratories during the last decade, evidence has been accumulating that psychic abilities may have some scientific basis after all.
The majority of the scientific community doesn't believe in the existence of psychic phenomena, and I'm afraid that demonstrates that the majority of the scientific community is simply ignorant.
I believe anyone who dispassionately looks at the experimental work in this field will come away from it feeling that there is certainly something here that deserves further investigation.
Some scientists are much bolder. Last year, for the first time, they backed their laboratory findings with hard cash and used psychic powers to speculate on the future price of silver. And they made money. But in Russia, psychic research appears to have a more sinister face. To control people's behavior. But is it really credible that man has psychic powers? The power of language, speech and reason, yes, and the 5 senses. But a 6th sense. What's the evidence for extrasensory perception? For the Victorians, mind reading was just a pastime. They called it telepathy. But in 1882, a group of distinguished British academics founded a society to investigate paranormal phenomena scientifically. Although their main interest was in contacting the dead, their first research project concerned the living. Then, as now, many ordinary people reported strange telepathic experiences and premonitions of the death of distant loved ones, especially when the death was unexpected or violent. They collected over 700 cases, but most other scientists were skeptical. They said this was only anecdotal evidence, and the cases could be explained as mere coincidence. If people had strange faculties, they should be scientifically investigated by psychologists. Psychology as a science really began in the 1930s, when Skinner's work on pigeons said conditioned reflexes explained the mind and faculties of man. An American botanist strongly disagreed. His name, Joseph Banks Rhine.
If religion could refute materialism, it would be in a much firmer, sounder position, because it stands on the assumption that there's something spiritual or extra-physical about man.
In 1935, Rhine came here to Duke University, North Carolina. It's a leading center for science and medicine, but it's most famous, some would say infamous, as the place where he began research into psychic powers. Aiming to put it on a scientific footing like conventional psychology, Rhine called his research parapsychology. He began with these 5 now famous distinctive cards. With cards, he could use statistics to assess the results of his experiments. A typical test of a subject's psychic powers. She has to guess the order of a pack of 25 cards dealt face down by the experimenter. She points to each symbol to indicate her guess.
There.
The experiment is over. Now he counts up the number of correct guesses.
You got 1 circle.
To find out if she's psychic,
3 crosses.
he uses the laws of chance and statistics.
2 waves.
The pack of 25 cards contains 5 lots of 5 separate symbols. Over a long series of tests, she ought, on average, to guess 5 cards right just by chance.
6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. That's marvelous. 6, 1.
But one experiment proves nothing.
4, 6.
Rhine did thousands of
2,
trials
2.
on hundreds of people. This one tests mind over matter. Affect the fall of dice to make, say, double 6.
5, 1. 2, 1.
Constant testing was necessary because for statistical proof, they needed consistent scores above chance. One complex experiment on foretelling the future. She has to list these symbols in the order she thinks the experimenter will list them after the test. A special book of random numbers tells him what order to put his list in.
This is a very good score. You would expect a score of 5 by chance, but you have a score of 11. So that's really very fine.
Rhine identified 4 psychic abilities: telepathy, mind-to-mind communication; clairvoyance, seeing things at a distance; precognition, knowing the future. These he called extrasensory perception. On its own, psychokinesis, moving things at a distance. And they were all called psi. Rhine said he had firm proof for 3.
We can say that clairvoyance, the precognition, and PK of moving targets are in this very firm category. It begins to look as though it's the capacity, psi capacity in general, including ESP and PK, is a natural property, natural capacity.
Mark Hansel is Emeritus Professor of Psychology at Swansea University in Wales and is widely regarded as the world's most authoritative critic of research in parapsychology. He says Rhine's experiments were poorly conducted, his evidence was feeble, and, in any case, against common sense.
There are plenty of cases of everyday activities which, if telepathy were possible, or precognition, or psychokinesis, this would become quite manifest. If anybody was telepathic, they should be able to quite easily demonstrate the effect to anybody. I'd be completely satisfied by just talking to the person for a few minutes and asking to say what I was thinking of. No difficulty. With the experiments there'd be no difficulty. If if one could confirm the result. But the plain fact is that they don't confirm. The results are entirely what one would predict from a normal knowledge of the way people behave in experiments and the way people... the past history of the subject, for example, which shows that there is a very, very high incidence of both experimental error and straight outright trickery in parapsychology.
Since the 1930s, about half a dozen experimenters have been found fiddling their results. The most celebrated was in the 50s, a Briton, Dr. S.G. Soule. But more damning for Rhine was that other scientists couldn't repeat his findings, and Rhine himself found his own subjects' initial high scores tended to decline, making convincing statistical proof hard to get. So since then, parapsychologists have tried meditation, relaxation, and even hypnosis to improve performance. This is a really complex test, to guess the symbol on the card you're dealing and match it to the cards hidden in the black envelopes. Double ESP. It's claimed there is indeed a noticeable improvement, but again, nothing spectacular. But at the City College in New York, Professor of Psychology Gertrude Schmeidler found a new way of improving on Rhine's results. She did a mammoth series of experiments to test her theory that certain groups of people are better at ESP than others. The test conditions looked watertight as well as impossibly difficult. The lists of ESP symbols were hidden sometimes hundreds of yards away. Over 1,300 people agreed to take part. But before they did the test, they were asked if they believed in ESP or not, and whether they were confident they'd succeed. They had to guess a list of 25 symbols made up of the standard 5 basic patterns. As in Rhine's experiments, the laws of chance say they'd expect to get 5 right just by accident. After over 10,000 trials, the scores of the believers and non-believers were added up separately. On average, the believers got just over 5 right, and the skeptical non-believers just under. Although small, the difference is statistically extremely significant. It's called the sheep-goat effect. Other scientists have also found a pretty consistent sheep-goat difference in 30 other experiments. They've studied personality, too. Although less clear-cut, extroverts seem to be better at ESP, and neurotics rather worse. The data were beginning to suggest that there might be something in ESP after all. So, what's the evidence for the first ESP faculty? Telepathy. Parapsychologists knew that people often reported psychic experiences in their dreams. So in the early 60s at the Maimonides Medical Center in New York, controlled experiments were done in dream telepathy. A picture would be looked at by a sender who tried to transmit it to someone asleep in another room. During the night, the sleeper was woken and told to say what he was dreaming of. This is a recreation of a typical nightly trial.
And a lady, a goddess, came walking over the ocean, and in her right hand, she let loose a butterfly, a green and pink butterfly.
The laboratory reported significant results in 9 out of a total of 13 studies, which led Charles Honiton to design an even better experiment.
Dreaming, hypnosis, meditation, and similar states do share certain common characteristics, the most important of which seem to be that they are all associated with functional sensory deprivation. So we developed a technique that involves a mild sensory deprivation or perceptual isolation procedure called Ganzfeld.
Red globes over the eyes, white noise in the ears. A sensory deprivation technique developed by a German who called it Ganzfeld, meaning whole field. Again, the subject tries to pick up any telepathic transmission from the sender in another room. She's looking at Viewmaster slides of Las Vegas. This experiment is not a simulation. It was filmed as it happened. These were the subject's words.
Some kind of a landscape. It's the name of a nightclub. Marquees, nightclub marquees. Just seeing them. Nightclub marquees in Las Vegas.
It seemed a direct hit, but for statistical analysis, the experimental protocol required the subject to examine the Las Vegas slides and 3 slides of other places and say which one was closest to what she'd seen.
There are a lot of things here that seem to correspond with the imagery that I was getting.
It is.
Yeah, Las Vegas.
Las Vegas.
Yeah.
To date, nearly 1,800 Ganzfeld sessions have been done in 15 laboratories, and almost half of them have shown significant results.
Ganzfeld techniques free the mind from constraints. They reduce the amount of noise or distraction in the nervous system, and the results are generally quite successful. I would say that in my own work, about 75% of our experiments yield significant results, that is, evidence of psychic functioning.
Okay, now how's that? Is that one all right?
But not everyone has been so successful. 7 laboratories have found absolutely nothing. Someone who has consistently failed to find any ESP is Susan Blackmore, once a keen psychic researcher. Parapsychologists admit there are many experimenters who do fail to get positive results, but say that's because of an experimenter effect. Something about them interferes with the delicate psychic process.
I can see a horse, beach, hills.
For Blackmore, that explanation is too convenient.
Some people say it's because I didn't have the right attitude towards the experiments, I didn't believe strongly enough that it's a kind of experimenter effect, that if the experimenter doesn't have the right attitude, he'll fail. There are any number of problems with that, because in the beginning I was a believer. Now, obviously I can't convince you or anybody else that I believed 10 years ago. I can only say that I know it myself, and I know people who knew me then who say so. And yet I still didn't get results at that stage. I certainly don't get them now. The other possibility, of course, is that there's no ESP anyway, and that I just don't get results because it's not there.
Most scientists, of course, would agree with her, as does Professor of Psychology Ray Hyman. He's scrutinized all the published Ganzfeld experiments and criticizes the way many of them were done. First question, how was the sender's picture actually chosen? Second question, how did the subject judge the correct picture?
I think I'll put this one first.
Okay, number 2 is going first, right? Yep.
There were sensory leakage, the possibility that the same targets that were actually handled, the target that was actually handled by the subject was actually given to the recipient to judge. There could be a possibility of various kinds of sensory clues that way. I found that 52% of their experiments used inadequate methods of randomization, like hand shuffling of slides and things that we know better now today. That might have been okay in the days of 30s when Ryan was doing experiments with cards, but not today.
For example, if the sender's picture had been selected at random by hand, like this, Hyman said the experiment was invalid. It should have been chosen by computer. Hyman also discounted an experiment if the actual picture or slide being transmitted by the sender was the same one given to the subject to judge. Fingerprints or deliberate marks could have given a clue to the correct picture.
And then that one's going to be last. Okay, fine.
But Hyman admitted he couldn't explain direct hits like Las Vegas other than as coincidence.
Nightclub marquees in Las Vegas.
But Professor Hansel has another criticism.
If they want to regard the subject as scientifically, as it were, demonstrated or proved, they have to accept the normal criteria which scientists adopt. And if one has to demonstrate the existence of some very unlikely phenomenon, one needs a demonstration of that phenomenon, which will almost invariably give the same result.
So, a scientific finding to be valid must be almost 100% repeatable. But other psychologists disagree and say that parapsychology is every bit as good as conventional psychology.
The evidence for science is comparable to the evidence for a variety of other phenomena in psychology. There's no great difference in the quality of the best researchers working in the field, the quality of the research they do, nor the nature of the evidence. It is true that the phenomena cannot be demonstrated on demand in the way in which in an elementary physics laboratory you can count on everybody's demonstrating exactly the same phenomenon. There's nothing like that in parapsychology. There's nothing like that in some fields of psychology, too. But because the phenomena don't seem so intrinsically unbelievable, people don't often put them to the test. Where they have been put to the test, there's often a lack of repeatability, too. In parapsychology, as in many fields of psychology, there is still a kind of repeatability in the sense that if a particular kind of experiment is done in many different laboratories by different people with different specific circumstances, similar results turn out very frequently, though not always.
But the fundamental objection to the claims of the parapsychologists is that psychic phenomena appear to conflict with the laws of nature, and indeed physics, one of the most advanced and successful sciences in the world. Though the secrets of the atom have been probed in detail, it's generally accepted that physicists have found nothing that would provide a mechanism for psychic phenomena. But the pioneers of quantum physics in the 20s did recognize that their revolutionary discoveries made the fundamental nature of reality a much more open and uncertain question than in the days of Newton. Classical physics believed matter followed regular, determined laws. But the new physics found that within the atom, many things happened by pure chance. A few physicists asked, if matter is so unpredictable, could it be affected by mind and explain psychokinesis? Some people, it said, have the power to move objects merely with their mind. Dr. Helmut Schmidt is a former research physicist with Boeing. He claims that mind can indeed affect the fundamental particles in matter. This is a lump of harmless radioactive rock emitting a stream of decaying atomic particles. The particles come out completely at random. To see if people could affect them mentally, Schmidt built this machine. Inside, a radioactive source triggers the lights to go a step one way or the other, completely at random.
Physics says there is a time when this atom decays is determined by pure chance. And so a good speculation, I think, is that where the physicist says this is pure chance, there the mind has a small place to enter.
Schmidt found some promising subjects and after preliminary successful trials did a formal experiment with two of them. This is a reconstruction.
Focus your attention, you feel one with the light, you think nothing else, just work on the light. You see it, you try to move it around this way.
She had to try and think the random lights to go clockwise. The second subject had to do the same.
Ready and go.
But though he tried to make the lights go clockwise, they tended to go anti-clockwise instead. But it was nonetheless inexplicable by the laws of physics. After 50 runs, the data showed the girl had indeed consistently made the lights go clockwise and the man the reverse. The effect was small, only a 2% deviation from chance, but highly significant to any physicist.
It looks like a small effect, but we did the experiments long enough that we could say it was not chance anymore. These people were not lucky. It was a real systematic effect. And 2% may not play a big role in, you ask what it is good for, but from the basic viewpoint, there is something which is inconsistent with physics. And we certainly are used to work with small effects in physics.
Obvious thought, was his machine really random? Well, Schmidt tested it exhaustively, but he reported that when no one was trying to influence it, the lights moved completely randomly. But Professor Hansel believes the results can be explained by fraud.
It is possible for that either the subject or the investigator or some other person could have contrived to produce that result. If I was the subject, I think I could. I can't be certain because I haven't had this confirmed by Schmidt, but I think I could, with a little cunning, affect the apparatus to try to achieve a high score. It's also possible that that machine can be fiddled in some sort of way by the investigator, using his nail file or something in the printout apparatus.
Naturally, Schmidt totally rejects Hansel's explanation. He says his machine had elaborate safeguards to detect any malfunction, including tampering, and there were 2 permanent records of each trial, in the machine and on tape. Even fellow critics question Hansel's approach.
Hansel has a tendency to believe that if any experiment can be shown to be susceptible to fraud, then that immediately means it no longer can be used as evidence for psi. I do sympathize with the parapsychologists who rebut this by saying, well, that can be true of any experiment in the world because there's always some way you can think of how fraud could have gotten into an experiment. You cannot make a perfectly 100% fraud-proof experiment. This would apply to all science.
Another of Schmidt's mind-over-matter experiments. Here he asked 35 subjects to try to make the red light come on more often than the green. This time, the experiment was run from 30 feet away in the basement. The lights were controlled by one of 2 random generators, which swapped between each other, also at random. One generator had much more complex electronics than the other, but interestingly, the subjects did equally well on both, scoring 4% above chance. Schmidt concludes psychokinesis must be goal-oriented. People seem to be able to make it work without understanding how they're doing it. But Professor Hansel's not impressed.
It's very difficult to see why so much interest and time has been spent on these experiments. If Schmidt could get a reasonable demonstration and get about 4 other people or 4 other departments to get the same result, then one should start taking an interest, and other people could see if they could get the result. And if it was possible, one would expect that in a very short time it would be completely established that using this apparatus, that people could affect the apparatus and change the emission of electrons, whatever Schmidt claims is happening. But until that happens, it's much more likely that these particles obey the normal laws of physics as we know them at present.
But using identical apparatus in 1981, Dr. Dean Radin, a psychologist at the prestigious Bell Laboratories, published a successful replication. A year later, Dr. Robert Morris at Syracuse University published another replication. Charles Honiton did 3 replications in the mid-70s. In fact, 19 scientists have confirmed Schmidt's findings, including plasma physicist Robert Jahn. He's Dean of the School of Engineering at Princeton University, and in February 1982, he presented the data from a 15-month study of psychokinesis on random events inside a solid-state electronic component, with very similar results to Schmidt. Schmidt now believes his fellow physicists can no longer ignore the evidence.
If present physics cannot explain these phenomena, that means that physics isn't complete. And physicists are quite used to drastic changes. They have changed their worldview in the past very often. And so I would expect in the long run a merging between psi research and physics.
Helmut Schmidt's not the only physicist to pioneer experiments in psychic phenomena. Others have joined him from the high-powered world of the laser. In 1977, 2 laser physicists published an account of their research at the Stanford Research Institute in California. Harold Puthoff is a laser patent holder, like his colleague Russell Targ, and they've made an intensive study of the third major psychic faculty, clairvoyance. The ability to perceive things hidden or at a distance. They called it remote viewing.
For the past 10 years, we've been investigating a phenomenon called remote viewing. In this experimental series, which has been carried on now with hundreds of subjects in the laboratory, we found that many individuals are able to accurately describe what's going on in distant locations, blocked from any kind of ordinary perception.
Stanford Research Institute is a major scientific establishment that handles hundreds of private and government research projects a year. Targ and Puthoff began their first formal experiments in 1973 with a psychic, Pat Price. Typically, they were done like this. While Targ remained with Price in the laboratory, Puthoff left with a colleague for a nearby location without, naturally, telling Targ or Price where he was going. At a prearranged time, Price tried to locate him. The electrically shielded cage guarded against radio contact, and an impartial witness was always present. The Price experiments are among the most challenging in the whole history of psychic research, so we are reconstructing them in some detail, drawing on the records and transcripts of the original experiments. Pat Price, who was a bluff, no-nonsense police commissioner, died in 1975.
What kind of place do you experience them at? What do they seem to be doing at their location?
An actor speaks his words.
Well, they seem to be high up in a tower. I keep flashing on Coit Tower. I see there's red roofs, tile floor and roof. Now they're walking through colonnades. It seems to me this it's a building, a separate building by itself, a library, a museum of some kind. Could this be Hoover Tower at the Stanford campus?
It was. Puthoff had indeed gone to the top of the Hoover Tower. Below him were the red roofs and red tiles as described by Price. Price had also correctly identified colonnades and the fact that the tower contained a museum and library. But could it have just been a lucky guess? Was there a flaw in the experimental procedure? The Hoover Tower target site had been selected from one of 60 possible locations locked away in the laboratory director's office. A mini-computer had been used to generate a random number indicating the envelope to be chosen. In another experiment, the target chosen was a local marshland nature reserve.
I get this image of crosshairs, looking at crosshairs. Well, getting closer, it's more like an intersection. I get the feeling of a botanical area with crosswalks, very geometrically laid out.
A direct hit, but notice the catwalks can only be seen as crosshairs from the air. Another target site, swimming pools.
I get the impression of a water treatment plant. It looks like water storage tanks. It's a service road down here.
Price sometimes drew what he saw.
Chain link fence.
We were surprised at the accuracy that Price was able to generate in his transcripts. In one of the cases where the target was a swimming pool complex, he actually described the dimensions of the pools to within 10% of their physical size. When he looked at the various sites he was able to describe for us, it was as though he came zooming in from thousands of feet in altitude, scanned the Bay Area until he found the people at the target site, and then described what they were looking at. It was not as though he was reading their mind, because frequently he would describe items at the site that the outbound experimenters hadn't even seen.
For the fourth experiment, the laboratory director took matters into his own hands. Wondering if there might be some hidden flaw in the procedure, or indeed outright fraud, he drove out of SRI with Puthoff with deliberately no idea of his final destination. He decided to head west, but after 5 minutes suddenly changed his mind and went in the opposite direction, and then kept on changing direction at random. Finally ended up about 5 miles up the coast at an out-of-the-way marina.
Can you tell me what you're experiencing with regard to where our outbound experimenters have gone?
What I'm seeing is a boat dock or a jetty. It's about in that direction from here. Yes, a lot of little boats, motor launches, sailboats. Some of the sails are furled. Boat dock or jetty. It's funny. Someone flashed in. Chinese or Japanese pagoda-like effect.
Does that pagoda effect have anything to do with the boat dock that you saw initially? Is that near where they're standing?
It's behind them. It's like a restaurant. Highly manicured lawn. Where the hell would that be?
The building was indeed a restaurant. That summer, Price did 9 remote viewings in all. Targ and Puthoff then had all the data independently assessed. A scientist totally unconnected with the project went to each of the 9 target sites armed with transcripts of all the experiments. He was asked to read each transcript and then judge which of the 9 sites most closely corresponded to the various descriptions Price had given. It was a final, completely objective test of whether Price really had been as psychic as he seemed. The results confirmed just how accurate Price had been. Out of the 9 sites that he'd remotely viewed, no fewer than 7 of his descriptions were clear enough for the judge to correctly match them to the actual site. Inevitably, results like that have drawn the critics' fire. Dr. David Marks is universally acknowledged as the world's leading critic of remote viewing. He's a psychologist in New Zealand and has conducted remote viewing experiments himself, but without success.
Well, I used to think that the Targ and Puthoff experiments might have been a genuine phenomenon, but after looking at their data and doing my own experiments, I've concluded that it's one big illusion.
An illusion not because of the way the experiments were carried out, but because of flaws in the judging procedure. After scrutinizing the transcripts, he said the results had another explanation.
I discovered that there were all kinds of cues littered throughout the transcripts. For example, dates, times, references to previous experiments that had been conducted earlier that day or the day before and so forth. And it also turned out that the list of places for the Price series had been given to the judge in exactly the correct order. so that it was possible to combine this information, to put the transcripts in correct order, and naturally produce a perfect matching with the target list.
These are some examples of the cues Marx picked out from the transcripts. They were casual remarks made during the various experiments, but Marx said they would be sufficient to give the independent judge clues to the order in which the experiments were carried out. Marx gave those cues to independent judges in New Zealand, together with a list of the sites in the order the experiments had been done, and Marx claimed that from the cues alone, his judges were able to match up the viewings just as correctly as the one in California. But did the original judge really use those cues to make his assessment? Another psychologist who studied the experiment doesn't think so.
From a common sense point of view, when you look at the degree of psychic functioning in the SRI remote viewing material, the cues are trivial. When the psychic is saying, I see a lot of little boats in front of me at a dock, and you're standing at the target where there are a lot of little boats in front of a dock, you don't need to look for tiny little cues that say this must have happened in an afternoon and must have been at least the fourth one in this series. You know what it's about. The psychic functioning is overwhelming.
Nevertheless, Professor Tart conducted an experiment designed to assess the validity of David Marx's criticisms. He set about the painstaking task of going through each of the Price transcripts. First, he renumbered the transcripts so no one could possibly know in what order the experiments had been done. Then he removed all the cues, like times of day, the odd phrase Marx had complained of. Tart then found another independent judge who knew nothing at all about the experiments, gave him the 9 edited transcripts, and sent him off to the same 9 sites. The results were as before. Price was right on 7 occasions. But Marx says this still isn't good enough.
Tart's judge would have had access to the book published by Targ and Puthoff, which actually prints details from at least 4 of the transcripts from the Price series. And so either by just looking it up in the book or by using memory from previously reading the book, the judge could have matched up the transcripts quite correctly by totally non-psychic means. And the other factor, of course, is that one of Targ and Puthoff's collaborators, Charles Tart, actually did the editing. And we simply can't trust this type of editing since he's obviously biased.
It's a charge parapsychologists have often faced.
This is what scientists call an ad hominem argument, and it's a wonderful compliment to one's professional integrity, because it means that what you've done is so obviously correct that your critics are reduced to questioning your integrity. I'm flattered and honored.
Russell Targ has a more unorthodox response to his critics.
Well, there's of course no way to deal with people who don't want to know. By and large, the critics who've been interested enough in our work to come to our laboratory, we have asked them to take part in experiments and experience remote viewing themselves. We'll sit them down, have someone go and hide in the Bay Area, and then with a lot of preparation on their part, we will be able to elicit a remote viewing description from them, which is often very accurate indeed. And the activity of experiencing successful psychic functioning has been a substantial motivation to skeptical people changing their mind.
Sympathetic scientists at SRI tried first. This tennis court was the target, and this is what was drawn. A drawing by another scientist. He described a building 40 feet high with a symbol on the wall. The target was a windmill 5 miles away. A totally skeptical scientist made these drawings. The target was a merry-go-round. How does Targ get ordinary people to do it?
We spend a lot of energy getting their agreement that it's permissible and expected for them to succeed. We think it's important in dealing with viewers, especially inexperienced viewers, that we portray psychic functioning as an ordinary and desirable and useful mental ability.
But in science, the key test of an experimental finding is whether it can be replicated. Dr. Elizabeth Rauscher is a theoretical physicist who has also investigated remote viewing. She's done 8 full-scale studies and replicated the SRI findings in 6 of them, sometimes over very long distances. One of her subjects tried to describe where someone was 2,000 miles away in New Orleans.
Circular patterns and rings and discs, as if looking down on them from the top. It looks like a large saucer just sitting in the middle of a city.
The person was here, at the Superdome. Remote viewing has even been tried across the Atlantic. Marilyn Schlitz, at 26, is one of the youngest of today's parapsychologists. In 1979, she published her first successful replication of remote viewing with 24 students as the viewers, and then decided to have a go herself. At noon every day for 10 days, she tried to find a friend of hers in Rome. He visited a different place each day, chosen at random. How on earth do you find someone nearly 5,000 miles away?
You give yourself a signal. You tell yourself what you're looking for, a very specific task. I'm looking for the target site, not any other of the zillion things there are in the world. The first time I personally tried to do it, the kinds of impressions I got were very similar to what I'd had like in a daydream. They were very faint, and it required effort to bring those faint impressions into a form that could be recognized and could be articulated.
Her 10 viewings were independently judged and 6 were spot on, Rome Airport being a particularly striking hit. So, has remote viewing been proved?
If a number of people in different laboratories can get these results, then you have to start really giving it some credibility. We've done a review. 2 colleagues and myself have done a review of the remote viewing work and have found that out of 28 formal remote viewing studies that have been published, over half have been reported as statistically significant. And these are in various laboratories across the United States. I feel at this point that we have very strong evidence to support the remote viewing hypothesis.
For many parapsychologists, the question is no longer, does remote viewing exist, but how does it work? Hella Hamid is a professional photographer and also a successful remote viewer. In a series of 10 experiments at Stanford Research Institute, she was asked to look inside a sealed canister from 200 yards away. To assess the limits of remote viewing, they wanted to discover how small an object the viewers could see. Hella Hamid was right 7 times. In one experiment, she made this drawing and said her strongest image was like a belt. Inside the can was this leather belt keyring. In another experiment, she described a long, thin, silver-colored object with a nail head at the end. The hidden target was a bobbin and pin. If there are no limits on land, what about under the sea? Seawater is an excellent shield for virtually all electromagnetic radiation. Would it interfere with remote viewing? Apparently not. Even at 500 feet down and 500 miles from the target, the viewer correctly described an enclosed space with a pool, large doors, and people walking around. The target was a shopping center with an indoor pool. But although the mechanisms of remote viewing are currently inexplicable, Targ isn't worried.
We don't feel that this contradicts modern physics, and it certainly doesn't make modern physics wrong, because modern physics is an enormously successful body of knowledge. What it says is that modern physics is incomplete in many ways and is presently inadequate to describe the data that we've accumulated over this past 10 years' research.
Stand by. Turn over.
We asked to see a real live experiment.
Take one.
Today is Tuesday, February 8th, 1983. It's 10 minutes after 10, and this is a remote viewing experiment with Russ Targ and Hella Hammett.
We had 6 envelopes containing names of different places in San Francisco. And at 9:30 a.m., we chose one of them at random. We'll reveal the target at the end of the experiment. At 10 o'clock, the BBC's Sonia Ledley went to the site with SRI researcher Keith Harari. The 6 possible sites were St. Mary's Cathedral, columns by a lake, a supermarket, a whale skeleton in a museum, a modern stone fountain, and a sailing ship moored by a dock. Hella Hammett was 30 miles away. No one in the room had any idea which site had been chosen. At 10:10, she began her description.
I've been having for quite a while, and I'll draw it in a minute, very geometrical. It's a diagonal kind of. This is the light wood, you know, wood area. It's light. It's beige. Okay, and then along here is this wall, which seems to be made off of large building stones or some other textured material.
Can you pull away from the wall a little bit?
Okay.
As you stand where they are and look at the interesting aspect, what comes into view? You just pop your eyes open and look at the thing that they're looking at.
They seem to be looking at some small detail of something. Almost something as if they picked it off the ground and they're both looking at it in the hand. And I got this feeling of close inspection.
Hella, could you drift up in the air and look down on this site? Do you see a plan view that you could draw?
A compound. It has sort of long walls which are windowless. There may be in the middle one entrance. The walls are thick, very thick. A fortress-like. It's like a fortress. I would say it has a mausoleum kind of feeling. It's sort of silent. That's why I would tend to think it's not something that is being used. It's quite a silent place. Inside too, there is almost no activity. Museum-like. It's either fallen into disuse or it's not something that I would choose to spend a lot of time in. Okay?
That sounds very good.
That kind of feeling.
Thank you.
Okay.
So, which site had they been at? Well, the throw of the dice had picked the whale skeleton at the local museum. Hella Hammett had said museum. She had also said thick windowless walls. As it turned out, the museum kept the skeleton locked up.
This is it?
They'd closed it to the public 3 years ago, and Hammett had used the words fallen into disuse. But she didn't report seeing the whale skeleton itself, although she had said mausoleum. She also said she got the feeling of close inspection. Sonia had indeed examined this stone. and Hamid's description of the place as a fortress-like compound was particularly striking from the air. We sent full transcripts of her viewing to 2 independent judges. They visited all 6 sites and said they thought the museum the closest match. How does Hella Hamid think it works?
I'm sorry, I can't give you explanations. If we had explanations, it would be wonderful. We've been working for so long trying to figure out how it works. We know it works, you know, with all the controlled experiments, but we don't really have very much idea how.
If remote viewing works, is it any more than a laboratory curiosity? After all, compared to normal vision, it seems pretty feeble. But in Los Angeles, one company thinks it can be exploited commercially.
Good afternoon, Mobius.
Mobius was founded 6 years ago by Stephen Schwartz, a 40-year-old ex-Navy consultant.
Okay, all right.
From small beginnings, it now has 10 psychics on the payroll.
Well, Mobius was set up to not only explore what psychic functioning is, but also what we can do with it. I think we've reached a point now in the last 100 years of research that we can say a reasonable man is willing to accept the idea that psychic functioning is a reality. And the question then becomes, well, what can we do with it?
This girl has been murdered. Stabbed. It's very bloody. And I see this strange, kind of narrow room where the murder was committed. It's almost maybe like a mobile home. I think the man who did it is dark.
For $5,000, Mobius will help you solve a murder case. The use of psychics by the police has a long and controversial history. Some report successes, others abysmal failures, and 2 controlled studies found psychics were useless. But Schwartz has a new system.
He might have tattoos on his arm.
I see a tattoo on his arm. The man is olive-complected, dark brown hair, brown eyes. He has a mustache. He's very clear in my mind's eye right now.
In the same way that a journalist would talk to a lot of eyewitnesses, we have several psychics, each picking up the same information, and then average out their reports and come to some general consensus of what did in fact happen.
And I see him driving.
We need to stop thinking of this as something that is occult or weird. We need to begin to think of this as a kind of remote sensing technique that has a signal-to-noise problem.
Lancaster County Police Headquarters in Pennsylvania. Recently, they asked Stephen Schwartz to get his psychics to work on 2 unsolved cases. The one we saw earlier is still sub judice, but the district attorney, Michael Rank, was prepared to talk about the other, the case of a missing girl.
I sent Mr. Schwartz a photograph of the missing girl and told him that we had a 14-year-old girl who was missing and we'd like to know her whereabouts and her condition.
2 psychics were given this photograph and nothing else.
Both of the respondents indicated that we had a dead person rather than just a missing person who was alive, some unknown location. Both of the respondents gave a cause of death, which at the time seemed to be paradoxical. One said that the cause of death was suffocation. The other said, I believe she was struck on the head. That didn't make any sense at the time, but when we discovered the remains, that turned out to be exactly what happened. She had had a stocking stuffed in her mouth, which caused a blockage of her throat airway. She had been struck on the cheek, causing fractures which extended into the sinus area, which would have caused bleeding to block the nasal passages. So after she was struck on the head, the bleeding blocked her airways and caused her to suffocate.
Rank said the psychics were also accurate about where they'd find the body.
It's impressed me enough to try it when we don't have anything else going. I think that naturally you couldn't use this as an investigative technique in every case. But if you've run down all your leads and you've got no place else to go, I think that it can give you some fresh approaches and it can stimulate the thought processes of the investigators.
Mobius have also gone into archaeology. In 1977, they located an unknown sunken ship. But their biggest project was to get psychics to find a buried city near Alexandria. Archaeologists already knew the city was somewhere in a 200 square mile area. Schwartz's psychics were spot on first time, locating this building and even describing some of the objects that would be found.
The psychic is a kind of remote sensing device which will provide us with a signal that has useful information in it. This is not a cure-all. It is not a magic bullet. It is not weird. It is a new tool that needs to be studied and that I think has a contribution to make to both science and humanity.
The most widespread application of psychic powers is claimed by healers. They've had a long and distinguished history. Healers always have a steady stream of patients medicine has rejected as incurable. Healers believe that it's possible to cure disease using only the power of their minds. Mind over matter, psychokinesis. Healers' successes tend to be dismissed by doctors as due to suggestion or spontaneous remission. But many parapsychologists now believe there is a psychokinetic effect at work. Dr. William Broad at the Mind Science Foundation in Texas is doing controlled experiments to test whether it's really possible to affect someone at a distance. In an isolated room 100 feet away, this girl is being played relaxing music. The state of her autonomic nervous system is being measured by skin resistance monitors on her fingers. The experiment is run automatically by a computer program. This tone is the computer's signal for a trial period to begin. Broad now tries to influence the girl. She's already relaxed, but during the trial periods, Broad tries to calm her even further. She, of course, has no idea when those trial periods are. A trial period ends after 30 seconds. Broad stops influencing, and immediately the pen trace, having been quite flat, starts to move. What we're showing you is not a simulation or a recreation. The experiment was filmed as it happened. There were 10 influencing periods in all, and analysis showed during them the girl was only a sixth as active.
These results are consistent with results from other laboratories that people can influence a variety of biological systems. We've done over 50 sessions like this, and overall the results suggest that one person is able to influence at a distance and mentally the physiological activity of another person. And since we've ruled out all possible conventional channels, then the only possibility that remains is a psychic influence.
It's in Russia that research on affecting people at a distance has been most developed. The interest of Russian scientists in psychokinesis may have something to do with this woman, Nina Kulagina, and her apparent power to affect matter. In the West, parapsychologists often consider this kind of area a minefield because many of the effects can be achieved by trickery. But in Russia, psychokinesis is taken very seriously. Karl Nikolaev is another Russian with apparent psychokinetic power. He's taken part in controlled experiments to discover its mechanisms. He could apparently light a lamp at a distance of 2 meters. Of course, it could be a clever trick. But the experimenter, Dr. Gennady Sergeyev of Leningrad, said the effect was genuine. He concluded psychokinesis might be some kind of electromagnetic radiation. But most of what the Russians are doing never gets out. A Soviet parapsychologist who now lives in San Francisco is Dr. Larissa Vilenskaya. For 7 years, she worked in Moscow's Laboratory for Bioinformation, working on clairvoyance and healing. She says much of the Russian research work is top secret.
There are at least half a dozen places in Moscow, Leningrad, and Almaty which do conduct classified studies in the field, and the direction of these studies is remote hypnosis and remote influence with the attempt of changing psychophysiological state of a person.
The Americans appear to take it seriously. In the last 10 years, the US Defense Intelligence Agency has done 3 separate reports on Soviet research into parapsychology. In a section on what they call telepathic behavior modification, the documents openly speculate on the military potential of the Russian research, using psi to influence an enemy. This is the kind of thing the Americans appear to be worried about. An experiment between 2 psychics described for us by Dr. Vilenskaya.
Kamensky was in Moscow and Nikolai was in Leningrad, and the distance is something like 600 kilometers between the cities. Kamensky imagined that he tried to strangle Nikolai. Nikolai was unaware at all what kind of telepathy transmission could be, but he felt that he couldn't breathe. And the test was accompanied by physiological monitoring, and this showed that the psychophysiological state of the subject was so dangerous that the physicians wanted to stop the test immediately. He was on the edge of unconscious state, and suddenly everything disappeared, and he came to normal state just because Kamensky in Moscow stopped to transmit this image. Just mental transmission, no devices, nothing, just power of our mind of a trained person.
Controlling Western leaders' behavior sounds like complete science fiction, but it's clear from the Defense Intelligence reports that the Americans don't entirely rule it out.
Well, now you'll make me all homesick again.
Professor Tart has done a study of military research in parapsychology. Is there really any truth in it?
I'm sorry you asked me about that. I would like to think, as some people believe, that psychic powers somehow come from some high spiritual level and can only be used for good. But I don't know anything else in this world that can only be used for good, so I'm afraid there are military uses for psi. Now, I say I hate to talk about this. The implications of it are fairly grim, and I don't think I really need to elaborate.
But behind the scenes, for over a decade, the US government has also been funding psychic research. And where? Stanford Research Institute in California, the place where Russell Targ and Harold Puthoff did all those experiments in remote viewing. Russell Targ left SRI last January and is now preparing a book on some of their recent research. But part of their work at SRI has never been fully reported. We asked him who'd been funding it.
We've been funded by a variety of private and governmental sources over this past decade.
What is the government, a source of government funding?
I really can't comment on the government funding at SRI. That would be a private SRI matter.
Are you saying that the work you've been doing is classified?
I really can't talk about matters of classification, as you can imagine.
We approached SRI, but they refused to talk to us. But it's clear from some of the published accounts that they've been working on an extraordinary version of remote viewing. They called it Project Scan8, and it involved a number of psychics, among them Pat Price, the policeman, Ingo Swann, a New York artist, and the photographer Hella Hamid. Scan8 stands for Scanning by Coordinate. The principle was to use the lines of latitude and longitude to remotely view anywhere on the globe. Only a few examples have ever been published. In one experiment, psychic Ingo Swann was asked, "What do you see at 49 degrees 20 south, 70 degrees 14 east?" Those were the coordinates of a small island in the Indian Ocean, the French island of Kerguelen. Swann immediately made this drawing, describing in topographical detail an island with bays, swamplands, and a large mountain to the west. Hella Hamid, who also took part in Project Scan8, answers the obvious objection.
People will say, oh, well, she knows her geography very well, and that obviously must be in the Indian Ocean and so on. We've done a lot of it, of translating the coordinates into binary numbers, which I have absolutely no idea what binary numbers are, other than it's a series of ones and zeros. And that worked very well. Matter of fact, it seemed to work better because I didn't sort of rummage around in my head, it's so and so far south and so and so far east, and it could be in the Sahara, it must be dry and so on, which is just clutters up this channel, which gives me the correct signal rather than thinking about it, because thinking is the worst thing you can do. Absolutely the worst.
For the Americans, the military potential must have seemed obvious, particularly after Swann was given the exact coordinates of a secret East Coast Army base, and he produced a drawing of the layout of the site that was reportedly correct in every detail. So, are they spying on Russia? Well, they say in theory they can view anywhere on the planet, and in one experiment the target was a small Russian town near Gorky called Kamenka. It's a center for the lumber industry, so there are logs everywhere. Psychic Keith Harari produced this drawing. It accurately showed a hill and buildings surrounded by poles. But have they viewed military sites? Well, in Washington, in a recent interview, the chairman of a congressional subcommittee on the intelligence services, Charles Rose, defended the SRI work by implying that military satellites had been used to verify it.
All I can say is that if the results were faked, our security system doesn't work. What these persons saw was confirmed by aerial photography. There's no way they could have been faked.
But why use remote viewing if you've got satellites? After all, spy satellites can now see objects only a few feet long. Hella Hamid's answer is that in some things psychics can do very much better than satellites.
Can you see things like buildings?
Oh, of course.
Can you look inside buildings?
I suppose.
Can you look inside buildings?
I think I have in the past, yes.
As it were, through the roof?
I don't know through what. Maybe through the cellar.
And you can see what's going on inside?
We have done experiments like that, yes.
How detailed can you get?
Well, I can't read. Pat Price could read. I can't. I'm quite illiterate psychically.
You mean you can't read words or documents?
No.
Pat Price could read documents?
I believe so.
Of course, it's impossible to show absolutely that Pat Price or any of them could do what's been claimed. The full evidence has never been released. But we do know that today at SRI, work is continuing under Dr. Harold Puthoff, and all publication of the research has ceased.
I'm sure that military research in Western countries on psychic stuff is inevitable for balance. My only hope is that somehow our culture will come to its senses and support open, unclassified research on parapsychology with investigators who have a humanistic, positive orientation toward human nature, so we can balance the inevitable negative uses that are going to be developed.
Psi research is at a crossroads. While mainstream science rejects it for lack of evidence, the military seem to be locking it up because the evidence looks too good. But last year, here in San Francisco, ESP entered the world of big business with the formation of a new company. It was called Delphi. Delphi's purpose, to find commercial applications for the SRI work which would make enough money to fund further research. A board meeting. There's Russell Targ. Next to him, psychologist and psychic Keith Harari. He's been active in the field for over a decade.
And you just get the final, and then we'll just come back that next week and put it together.
The commercial expert is business consultant Tony White. Delphi
exploration, the ability to take remote viewing out of the laboratory and apply it in a real-world situation.
Recently, satellites have been used to locate oil. Delphi believes remote viewing could do better by looking under the surface. Project number 2.
We are currently negotiating and closing a contract with Atari, division of Warner Communications, for an extensive consulting series starting sometime this year, which will involve psychically enhanced video games to help people develop their psychic abilities and enjoy themselves while they're doing it.
But there are others in the field. Charles Honiton's laboratory in Princeton has already developed a range of psychic video games. This is called Psyball. It's a test of psychokinesis. Keep the ball in the center of the screen with your mind. But Delphi's project number 3 is the biggest of all. It involves the last great psychic faculty, precognition. Of all the faculties, foreseeing the future is the greatest challenge to our concepts of space and time. Crystal ball gazing was at its height 3,000 years ago with the Greek oracle at Delphi. Now the 20th century company is trying to follow suit.
This is the remote viewing experiment.
It was in 1975 at SRI that Targ and Puthoff had done experiments to see if remote viewing could be made to look into the future. Hella Hamid was the first guinea pig, and this is a brief reconstruction of an early experiment. Where, she was asked, would Puthoff be in half an hour's time?
It's very dark, and at the end you come out through an archway, into a very bright area where there's lots of vegetation. It's like a rose garden. It's very formal. It's a very manicured kind of garden.
Throughout her description, Puthoff had been away from the lab, driving around aimlessly. At a prearranged time after her description had finished, a random number generator decided where he was to go. There were 9 envelopes, each containing a different location. Any one of them could have been chosen. The random number generator said 6, and 6 said go to Stanford Hospital Plaza. Half an hour before, Hella Hamid had described seeing a formal manicured garden, and apparently here it was. The next day, another experiment.
like a head of an arrow. He walks into it. It's like a triangle that he walks into.
Half an hour later, the randomly selected envelope said, "Go to the swing in Alma Park." This time, she not only saw into the future, but heard it too.
It's a rhythmic kind of squeak, like a rusty pump on not well-oiled piston. Just a very rhythmic squeaking.
2 other laboratories have since done their own successful experiments.
We have very good experience that people can accurately describe events that are hours or days in the future. What one must say is that the viewer in the laboratory is describing some future event that they will experience. That would be the customary way to describe this. We think a more accurate description would be that some future event which will take place causes the viewer at an earlier time to have an experience. To put in its worst form, the future event is creating his present. That's, of course, not to say that the future can change the past, but it's definitely clear that the future to not happen. But it's clear from our many experiments that a person sitting in the laboratory can have his experience controlled and determined by an event which is yet to take place.
At 9, 7, 9. At 9, 7 bit at 9. Yeah, at 9.
This is the Commodities Exchange in New York. It's where the world's precious metals are traded. And it was here that Russell Targ's new company, Delphi, decided to put precognition to the test.
For a number of private investors, in which we generate predictions for the commodity futures market. We've been working primarily with silver, predicting silver prices 2 to 4 days in advance. This research series has been quite successful and provides us with a nice stream of income.
Silver is cheap and its price is relatively unstable, so it's ideal for making a fast buck. Delphi developed a system to predict on a Thursday whether on Monday the price of silver would be up or down more or less than 25 cents. Delphi said in 3 months to December they'd made 9 predictions, all of which were correct. We asked an experienced commodity trader to comment.
The most unusual aspect of these people is that their ability or their willingness to predict not only the direction of a move and the magnitude, but to give you in silver a 25-cent prediction from Thursday to Monday, which is really sticking one's neck out. And I'm sure that they're the only people that I've ever heard of in the business that would go that far in a predicting way.
And in terms of being right 9 times out of 9?
Well, again, being right in anything in life 9 times out of 9 is unheard of. Absolutely unheard of. And in this business, it's incredible is a weak word. I'm trying to think of a better word. It's, I would say impossible. I'd like to see it done.
And so did we. So we talked to the broker who had acted for Delphi. He had the complete records of the transactions.
There were originally 9, from what I understand, 9 recommendations or forecasts which were made by Delphi, and out of which 7 were converted into actual trades. All these 7 were successful, as well as the 2 forecasts that were not translated into trades were successful, 2 would have been successful.
But could they have been following the market and gone with some kind of trend?
Well, I wouldn't say so, because the market in between September and December has been generally in an uptrend. Silver prices have been going up. But some of the more spectacular and successful trades were actually on the short side. That is, they sold before they bought back. So in other words, they were making money in anticipation, or they were making a prediction in anticipation of the market coming down, so going against the trend. For example, they sold the market on September 17, and then they bought back on September the 20th, profitably against the main trend. There was a transaction between the November 19 and November the 23rd, also on the short side.
Okay. Tony White, can you tell us how you did it?
No, I can't. It's a proprietary process which we've developed through our research, and we plan to keep to ourselves.
But it's done entirely psychically, is it?
Yes, it is. No other information is of any use at all.
Keith Harari had done the forecasting.
Target?
Probably something like this.
Can you do it again? Target?
They said it was a modified form of remote viewing, but it didn't involve looking directly at the numbers on the board. Earlier this year, however, the system failed. But they say they've now ironed out the problem and are poised to re-enter the market. And they're more than satisfied with progress so far.
Our investors made profits in the middle six figures, 1982.
Middle six figures, that is what, over $100,000?
Six figures is the initial $100,000.
So $500,000?
Somewhere between 100,000 and $1 million.
Parapsychology has come a long way since it guessed at cards. But orthodox science continues to reject it. After all, compared to our normal senses, they say, ESP and psychokinesis, if true, are feeble and erratic. And in any case, they violate the laws of physics and common sense. Extraordinary claims, they say, require extraordinary evidence. But parapsychologists say, today we now have that evidence in plenty.
Historically, a lot of criticisms have been leveled against the area, which have all been met progressively. So now the scientist is left with two alternatives. Either these data are real and should be accepted as any other data, or some kind of fraud is involved. And this fraud hypothesis doesn't make sense in terms of the distribution of the effects and the people who are doing the experiments. It becomes almost as paranormal as the hypothesis under investigation to assume that there's some giant conspiracy of producing fraudulent data.
Well, I think the evidence for the reality of psi is overwhelming. I don't see how any intelligent scientist can read the evidence for psi and doubt that it exists. Now, there are irrational factors that make people reject that, of course, but just the quality and sheer variety of the evidence is very powerful. Now, most scientists say psi apparently violates physical laws. But if you ask them precisely what does that mean, and have we investigated this empirically instead of just decided theoretically, you'll find out they haven't done anything. I don't think we know that much about the universe. And in fact, the exciting thing about psi is that while it appears to violate some of our known physical laws, understanding psi and beginning to fit it in with the other things that we know will mean we'll have a greatly expanded and more effective understanding of the ordinary physical universe.